why don't we get started? We are here in this Foresight for Change workshop. We are going to be talking about how you can use futures thinking and foresight as a practice to frame different actions today, and hopefully better actions today. My name is Lynn Jeffrey. I am the director of Foresight Essentials, which is the part of the Institute for the Future where we teach people how to develop their own practice and how to think like futurists. And I'm here with Vanessa Mason, who is a research director in our IFTF Vantage Organizational Partner Program. And you'll be hearing more from her in just a moment. If we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you, Carter. So the first thing we're going to say off the bat is that futures thinking is not about predicting the future. This is impossible to do, but it's entirely possible for anyone to learn how to think about the future more creatively and more systematically, and basically take the uncertainty of the future, which will always be uncertain because we can't predict, but to turn that into inspiration for action by having a more confident point of view about what might be and kind of pre-experiencing and play testing a whole bunch of different options. And so let's go to the next slide, please. I wanted to ask Vanessa to introduce herself and also to speak to two of the questions. And actually, Carter, if you could do another click on that slide, two of the questions kind of at the heart of this whole conference. Vanessa, tell us a little bit about how you have used futures thinking and how you're currently using it to think about radical agility and resilient strategies and a whole bunch of other things.
Sure. So my name is Vanessa Mason. I'm also a research director at IFTF, and a lot of my research focuses on a wide range of things that are in these very same questions. My background is in public health, and so I spend a lot of time thinking about how can we be healthier? How can we be more resilient, particularly as we look out to a number of future possibilities, which are going to make both of those things more challenging. Another area that my research focuses on is this question of belonging. So where can we find spaces, relationships, communities, networks, sort of builds a more affirmative narratives and culture that really help us to feel safe, to feel comfortable, to feel emotionally connected, and really to have spaces for meaning and sense making, again, particularly as things start to get really much more complicated, much faster dynamic changes happening in the world. And so I write a letter exploring newsletter exploring both of those topics, and really trying to sort of dig into where we can be more positive and where we can look for more spaces for meaning when it comes to belonging, as well as opportunities to kind of test out and think about what might be some strategies that we can start testing today to really help us to get to that place where in the future we are able to really and truly be radically agile in a more proactive manner rather than a more reactive manner.
Great. And let's go to the next slide, please.
So here are our objectives today. We're going to take a look into what might be some things that might affect the future of work. But really importantly, we want to give you some essential grounding in what futures thinking techniques and sort of key terms you might want to keep in mind and carry forward into today that really will help you to build a more informed perspective on how the future might be radically different than what we are experiencing today. If there's anything we've learned from the past 2 years is that things can change rapidly and dramatically. And unfortunately, that is not as rare as we would like to think. And so we really want to give you the tools today so that you can start being able to apply this to your work, to your personal life, to your communities, and being able to better sort of seek and anticipate how changes might happen.
Great. And next slide, please. Let me tell you a little bit about the Institute for the Future. Some of you, I'm sure, have probably never heard of us, and others are old friends. Institute for the Future is a nonprofit public interest organization. We were founded over 50 years ago. We're based in Palo Alto. And what we do is bring people together to think about the future in different ways so that they can make different plans today and really build the futures that we want. We have foresight training and teaching. We have a lot of research. And really, we are focused on transformative action in the present. And I love this image. It is a fashion show that we had at the Institute probably 5 or 6 years ago, with a bunch of designs of climate resilient fashion from the future. So we like to use not only kind of traditional research that looks like reports and PowerPoints, but also experiential futures, to try to bring the future to life and imagine what kinds of clothing we might need to wear in the future to be ready to deal with climate change. Next slide, please. We work with a lot of different kinds of partners. We work with a lot of academic institutions, and with public interest organizations like AARP. We work in healthcare, and we work with a lot of foundations as well. Blue Shield of California. We've done a lot of work on the future of work and health and the intersection of well-being and health. Technology companies, and a whole bunch of different organizations that are using foresight in lots of different ways. And one of the things that we wanted to offer to you today is kind of an entry point into thinking about how this kind of long-term thinking might be useful for you in your work, no matter what kinds of groups you work with or organization you're in. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk a little bit about some basic definitions of what we mean by futures thinking, foresight, strategic foresight, this kind of domain of professional practice. Next slide, please. At its most simple, we think about foresight as a set of tools and processes and ways of thinking that simply help us make better decisions under conditions of uncertainty, which we will always be in. But we can get better and more comfortable with making decisions, knowing that we're in the midst of uncertainty, and develop a more informed, proactive point of view about how things could be very different in the next decade or so. We do like to think about 10 years out. That's the time frame that we normally work at. Many professional futurists work in that time frame. It's far enough out that some of the big challenges and opportunities of today are going to play themselves out and lead to really different futures, but also not so far ahead that it is like science fiction, or impossible to imagine. Next slide, please. After working with all different kinds of organizations in the private sector and the public sector for many years, we have sort of developed a point of view about how you can use foresight in a cycle of activities that will help you create impact within your community, your organization. And you begin by preparing your evidence from today, thinking about what are the key questions you want to ask, collecting data, and sort of orienting yourself toward the long-term future. We then move into foresight, which is the practice of developing plausible and provocative visions of multiple futures. So we want to be telling stories and creating narratives about futures that we hadn't thought of before. And then to use those to generate implications and insights for ourselves. And finally, the purpose of doing all of this work is to frame and prioritize new kinds of actions. So when you think about and you spend a little bit of time in each part of this cycle, that is a way to ensure that you are going to be creating impact and some kind of value by doing this work. Next slide, please. We also find that generally the organizations that we work with use foresight to do a number of things, to challenge their assumptions that whatever they're doing right now is going to continue working, to bring people together to create a shared long-term vision and perspective. So one of the projects that we have done in the last couple of months has been with the Tipping Point organization, the Tipping Point Foundation, working with some of their grantees locally in the Bay Area to bring a number of different leaders from their grantee organizations together, and together create a shared perspective on what are the key sort of forces that are going to shape the next decade for them. What are the things that are going to open up new opportunities and new ways of doing things, and what are the risks? So having a conversation together and creating a shared vision about that long-term future really helps align for imagining and executing strategic action. We also use futures, of course, to think about long-term threats and opportunities. And then really we're preparing people to not just be ready for the future, but to actually help shape the future. Another project that we're working on at the moment is with the Transformative Justice in Education Center at UC Davis, working to help support them to develop scenarios about the future of education for Black children in California. And in that project, we are thinking about multiple transformative paths to a next decade of education, in which we might take several different approaches and try to play out what those might look like and what education for Black children in California could look like in 2032. So those are just a few examples of how we use futures and how organizations use futures. Next slide, please. Okay.
Yes, so I know that some of you did an introduction already, so I wanted to be able to build on this. So if you haven't already, please share your introduction. You are, or rather filling in, I am a blank, asking questions about the future of blank. And if you've already added that, I think it would be really interesting if you could also add, and my copy and paste unfortunately is not working, also thinking about the uses of strategic foresight. So where can you see, oh wow, that is really not copying over. When you think about how the future that you're curious about, what might be some ways that you want to use that? So kind of you can build on this phrase and say, I am a blank, your job title, asking questions about the future of blank. So in my case, it would be, I'm a social science researcher asking questions about the future of belonging so that I can. And for me, it's like I'm really interested in both bringing people together to create that shared long-term perspective and also being able to anticipate what are some long-term threats that might make belonging more constrained or otherwise not as accessible for folks, and as well as strategic opportunities. How can I begin to cultivate a future in which belonging is more available? So when you think about applications of future thinking, are you really you're curious about this future because you want to challenge assumptions? And I'm adding this in chat. Maybe you want to bring people together. You want to anticipate long-term threats. You're really looking for new opportunities.
So Vanessa, you want us to put, I am an X asking questions about X.
Yes.
In service
so that I can.
So that I can. Okay, great. Great. Let's see what people are, who we have in the room and what kinds of futures you're thinking about.
Wow, so we've got, I'm a business graduate student asking questions about the future of work-life balance in an increasingly demanding online environment. Certainly, Hillary, that's a really great one. Clarify your theory of change and strategy to create change. We work with a lot of organizations that really, they use sort of strategic foresight as a way of testing, does my theory of change still apply? Like the world is changing, context is changing, and it's a worthwhile exercise, of course, to say, does the way that we think that sort of causality happen, that expected impact is going to happen, still going to apply, given all of these changing sort of circumstances and consequences that might be emerging?
So I know we have more people in the room than I'm interested to see. Very good. Thank you.
Oh, wonderful. Hacking the workday to return free time to people. That is definitely a worthwhile mission. I've really been curious about a project around like the future of leisure, just because the way that we think about free time, leisure time, sort of time that isn't spent in productivity has changed so much that I wonder how it will define free time. I saw this troubling term called stress laxation, and I guess it refers to this phenomenon that even when we aren't working, we spend that time not working, stressing about the work that we still have yet to do.
Stress relaxation.
Because I hate the word, but the concept definitely hits close to home. Bruce, I'm a professor and a community activist examining possible climate futures so that we can plan in a way that is fair and safe for our whole community. That's a really great use of strategic foresight. And a really great way to invite people into to both of those, goals, that it both needs to be safe and it needs to be fair.
And I'd love to see, Hillary, you'd like to use future thinking to clarify theory of change. Is there a particular future that you're interested in? A particular future of something? Is it future of theories of change? I don't know. It would be interesting to see what future space, what future domain you're interested in. Okay, let's move on to the next slide, please. And we're going to introduce a few key terms that should help you be more intentional about practicing foresight. These are a kind of boiled down version of the work that the 50 or so staff at the Institute do every day for our work as foresight practitioners. And anyone can learn how to do these. Once you understand these key terms, you can at least get started. So let's go to the next slide, please. This is sort of at its most elemental what we do and what you can do as well. So we collect evidence from today about how the world is changing. And we generally tend to think of these as drivers of change, which are large, long-term forces, and signals of change. And we're going to dive into both of these in a moment. And then we combine these using our imagination, sometimes with a little bit of courage, because we want to push people to think beyond what perhaps is even desirable or imaginable, and including a lot of different expert voices. And in the futures work, what we mean by experts is extremely broad. Everyone is an expert on their own future, and certainly on the future of their community. So futures work is very participatory and includes the voices of everyone whose future will be impacted. So we combine these things, and then we create what we call future forecasts. So let's go to the next slide. And I'm going to jump into one of the categories, drivers of change. These broad, long-term forces that are really going to shape the context of the next decade. So if we're thinking 10 years out, we're really thinking about the year 2032. Between now and 2032, what are some of the really broad changes? Things that we know are happening, demographic changes, the growth of certain kinds of technologies, perhaps long-term legislative trends or economic trends. These are things that can be measured with quantitative indicators, and we can have both historical patterns that might have been happening, for several decades or even longer, as well as more recent emerging drivers of change. So, for example, remote work. If you were to look at remote work over the past, 30 or 40 years, you would see one pattern. And of course, it was extremely accelerated by the last 2 years of the pandemic. So drivers of change can move at different rates of change. And we also can think of them at different scales. So we might be looking at remote work around the world, or we might be looking at remote work within a particular industry, or even within just our own community or organization. And the important thing about drivers of change is that we use them in futures together. So we don't want to be thinking about the aging population as one, just think of the future of the aging population or the future of remote work. It's when you combine aging population and remote work and you think about them over the next decade that you start to be able to tell unexpected stories and see things in a different way. Next slide, please. We often use this framework. There are lots of different versions of this framework to remind ourselves to think beyond the obvious drivers of change. And so we want to be thinking about social drivers of change, demographics, kind of cultural trends, perhaps social movements, changes in household structure and household patterns, technological trends, looking at what's happening in R&D, in consumer technology and patents, economic trends, thinking about things like housing market, currencies, trade, environmental trends and drivers, thinking about everything from what's happening with water, climate, temperature, soil, agriculture. There are a whole range of things there. And of course, the political or policy space, thinking about things in the domain of perhaps immigration or legislation. So next slide, please. The way that we wanted to pause for a moment, and I know this whole conference has been to think about the future of work, whether you are thinking about, as you are, Maritas, your kind of personal, your next step and your personal future of work, or whether you're thinking more broadly for a particular community or a sector. Let's just together take a moment to think about what are the drivers that are going to shape the next decade of work in the future that you care about. So we have started with a couple of ideas here: the rise of online learning options, the growth of disinformation and propaganda, which is changing our information environment. Great one, Vanessa, growing disability due to long COVID. That would be a great example of an emerging driver of change. The growing impact of social justice movements and how those have transformed the workplace and will continue to. Experimentation with gender and sexuality identities, new practices, new norms that might change who works and why they work and how they work and what the workplace is like. Of course, the aging population in the United States, always something that if you're thinking about the future, you should be considering. Rising temperatures and the impact on different kinds of spaces and who has access to cooling technologies. So let's take a moment. Would love to hear what you are seeing in your space that you might add to this list. Long-term forces that will shape the next decade of work. Would love to see what people are thinking. Bruce, you're thinking about climate futures. Are there particular drivers of change that you're not seeing on this list that you would add? Hillary, Alana, I'm just seeing people's names who I can see here. Remote work is a key driver, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one that we still don't know how it's going to play out. Spencer, would love to see any other things that you're thinking about what might shape the future of innovation, work-life balance. Oh, universal health care. Cecilia, that's such a good one. Would you mind sharing just for a moment what you're thinking about and how you think that might shape the next decade of work? I don't know if you can come off mute and share. I don't quite know how this platform works, but we'd love to hear your voice.
I'm not sure if she can blend because of the platform, but definitely you can add more context.
You can try sharing audio and video, and then I can bring her up on the screen. But she can also put it in the chat.
So Cecilia, if you want to click the Ask to Share Audio button. I'm sorry. This is I'm not great at this platform. Do we have to ask her to share, or can she just share?
No, she has to ask to share first.
Okay. Well, if anyone wants to share and you want to, just click your Ask to Share and we'll see you. I can see these are great. No problem, Cecilia. These are really good. Increasing precarity, raising questions about the path of place of work. Pathway for communities without extensive resources to use technology to preserve their legacies. That's such an interesting driver. Pressures to reduce traffic. Yes. So thinking, Bruce, that's such a really important one as well. Thinking about drivers shaping transportation over the next decade, and whether that's due to remote work or kind of climate legislation or carbon neutral personal decisions. I think that will absolutely change the way that we think about work and how that plays out. Automation, absolutely, Spencer.
I also think of like all the urban planning pressures, like now that people have moved substantially because of the pandemic.
Absolutely.
That might have been more rural, now have a lot more traffic. Some places that might have been more heavily trafficked or have virtually none.
Absolutely. Neurological diversity, different concepts of diversity will absolutely affect and shape, I think, in really interesting ways what the next decade of work could look like. Of course, the 4-day work week will be very interesting. So again, when we're thinking about creating stories, visions, narratives, points of view about how this could be different, work could be different in the future, we want to combine some of these and ask, how do changing concepts of neurological types and neurological diversity, how might those intersect with the growth of disinformation and an aging population? So we want to think broadly and kind of intersect these different drivers, and we'll then start to be able to really have some new ideas. Great list. Thank you so much. Let's go to the next slide, please. Continuing security issues, absolutely. So the second really key concept here is the concept of signals of change. And Vanessa, I'm going to ask you to introduce signals to us.
Sure. Can we go to the next slide? So signals of change. So Lynn just wonderfully explained drivers of change. So drivers of change are these huge trends, these long-term, broad, huge changes that we see over the course of a decade. You can think of kind of signals as the inverse of that. There's something that is happening today. They're not happening at any other point in time. There's something that's very specific. They're necessarily narrow or otherwise really targeted in how they're showing up. And they're also very vivid, provocative examples of how the future could look like, or what might point to how our future might be different. So they are meant to sort of either sort of bring you a source of joy, to either cause some sort of degree of fear or surprise. They're supposed to elicit some kind of emotional reaction from you, precisely because it points to something rather distinctive that is not apparent, much like this red gummy bear is really sticking out in the sea of all of these sort of clear-ish gummy bears. So signals are really, there are small local innovations with that potential to disrupt status quo, that potential to disrupt what we know or we think we know is sure to be true today and sure to be true in the future. And importantly, because they are specific, they provide a lot of rich detail, a lot of rich data that points to how the future could be different. Both drivers of change and signals of change are kind of evidence of the future, but they perform different functions. Signals of change are really meant to sort of give us a sort of like a canary in the coal mine kind of effect. It's a way of sort of testing out what might be coming, a sort of early detection system of sorts that really helps us to think about and conceive of the future in sort of new and more divergent ways. That said, signals aren't meant to be in isolation, whether as a single signal, or they aren't sort of meant to sort of stand alone apart from drivers. You really want to use them together to be able to craft forecasts, because that's what allows them to be both plausible and that they are grounded in these long-term changes, as well as provocative and that they are these weird, bizarre signals of change that really evoke that emotional reaction about something being dramatically different or otherwise divergent. And so let's go to the next slide. So if that was explanation wasn't clear enough on what a signal is, here is what a signal isn't. Again, something like an example like this, rising rates of mental health disorders is not a signal. We have a lot of different evidence about the rising mental health disorders across the world in different populations in different countries. Even from these examples, you can see, you know, just the impact alone on changing global mental health. Certainly, you can see it changing year over year in a lot of different demographic populations over time. It's something that has been demonstrated time and time again that is happening. At this point, it is so broad, so large scale, and so mainstream that rising rates of mental health disorders at this point is really more of a driver than a signal. Again, to Lynn's point, these things can change in terms of scale or in rate. You know, obviously the pandemic has accelerated the pace of rising mental health disorders. They were already kind of trending in terms of they're already growing over time, and now that growth rate has accelerated. But the sort of expansive impact of this certainly is something that we know to be true, that is continuing to be true over time. Can we go to the next slide, please? So here's an example of a signal with mental health disorders. So Carter, can you click maybe 2 more times? Yes, thank you. So this signal comes from the Lancet, which is a major medical journal that's known across the entire world. And if you can't see the title of that paper, I will read it, but it says, "Young People's Voices on Climate Anxiety, Government Betrayal, and Moral Injury, a Global Phenomenon." And this really, the paper is focused on, this is the first large-scale investigation of what is called climate anxiety. And so it reveals a lot of widespread worry and anger among youth. So the what of this signal, which is usually when we look at signals, there's sort of kind of 3 parts to it. One is the sort of title of sorts. So that the first large-scale investigation of climate anxiety reveals widespread worry and anger among youth is the title of this signal. It tells you specifically what it's about, who it's about, and since where it's located, because it's a large-scale study. So there's a lot of specific, rich detail that is involved in this signal. And even more specifically, when you get into sort of the what they actually investigated, a global team of academic psychiatrists surveyed over 10,000 16 to 25-year-olds. So this is a really large study. Those youth were located in 10 different countries and found that over half reported feeling sad, anxious, angry, powerless, helpless, and guilty. Nearly half, so 45%, said that their feelings about climate change, which from that list you can hear are rather negative, were negatively affecting their daily life and functioning. So on a day-to-day basis, as these young people are moving throughout their day, climate anxiety is a serious sort of drain on their energy, their focus, sort of what they feel about the world and their place in it. And what I think actually makes this signal even more unique than the sort of study finding about the emotions, or what the authors conclude, which is that distress about climate change is associated with young people perceiving that they have no future, that humanity is doomed, that governments are failing to respond adequately, and with feelings of betrayal and abandonment by both governments and adults. So to have that sort of sense that, you know, you can't rely on institutions, you can't rely on people that are around you that are supposed to be taking care of you, that are supposed to be responsible, is something that these kids are going through. And I shouldn't say kids, they're actually young people, because they're 16 to 25-year-olds. So these are teenagers and young adults. They're folks that are getting ready to be in college. They're about ready to be in the workplace. Many of you might either be this age, or you're hiring people who are this age, or you soon will be. And they feel that they can't trust any institution that is around them to protect them from this major existential risk of the planet not being a habitable place to be in. That is certainly a sort of strong signal of not just climate, but just the impacts of climate change beyond what's happening to the planet that is going on, like really like how we're affecting an entire generation of folks and how they sort of interact with how the world is constructed today and who they trust. So certainly a huge signal of, yes, mental health disorders, but also what and who can be trusted. So next slide. So we want to offer a couple of questions for you to think about with signals of change. One is this: what are we moving from and what are we moving toward? And can you click through another time? So a couple of the from to statements that I thought might be useful were this notion that we're moving from government as a protector to government as a betrayer. Another might be that we are moving from the future as something to look forward to something that the future is something to dread. Like there isn't this sort of inherent hope in the future that we usually associate with youth because of the experiences that youth have had. And another question that you might want to use when you are looking for your own signals is, if this signal became the norm, how might the future be different? So we'll do this a lot at IFTF, but that for any given signal, it might be, okay, if this were everywhere, if this were otherwise used by so many people, if this were experienced by so many people, certainly what could happen. And if this particular signal were to scale, you might see an even broader generational divide, growing, perhaps even violent demands for a more competent government, community, and corporate response to climate change. And of course, the growing potential for a massive global youth movement that could drive a lot of changes that, yes, are climate change focused, but probably more broadly, just how the world and how society might focus as well. So those are two questions to keep in mind with signals. What are we moving from and what are we moving toward? And if this signal became the norm, how might the future be different? Let's go to the next slide. So also want to emphasize too that I realized that signal, of course, was very dark for a number of reasons. I'm sure that many of you might either have kids that age or know young people that age. And we really try to, when collecting signals and seeking signals in our own practice, to, yes, look for what is changing, but also importantly, try to orient toward what might be like a signal of hope, what might be something that causes you to feel more optimistic that something good could be happening, that there's something to look forward to in the future. It's both motivation in the short term, and it's also an acknowledgement that generally, although the world has had difficult periods, no matter what decade or century that we are looking at, there has always been hope that has been there, that has helped people sort of get through very difficult circumstances, and to be able to have that time and space to envision a different world, to take that provocation, maybe not of fear or maybe of anger, but that provocation of joy and of hope to say, you know, I know that things can be different. Let me go out and do something to have that be the case. So I'm going to go show one more signal that is a signal of hope quickly. This comes from another paper that recently was published 2 days ago, so on Wednesday, in Health Affairs, and it's looking at unionization and health outcomes. And more specifically, I don't know why that piece is missing.
I think we need one more click, Carter. Thank you. Yep.
Okay, there we go. The builds went in a different direction. So this signal is about another study, but it's a study that looked at unionized nursing homes versus non-unionized nursing homes, and really looked at not the workers' mortality rate, but importantly, the residents' mortality rate. And basically, this study, they had done an initial study some months back that just looked at a set of nursing homes. And this time they took a look at data in nursing homes across the entire continental 48 United States. So they just didn't get Alaska and Hawaii. So across 48 states, they found this to be persistently true, that if for unionized nursing homes, the health outcomes were better. There was roughly a 10% reduction in resident mortality. So these were sort of customers or people who were living in the nursing homes because the workers were unionized. Now, there's a number of different reasons why the authors conjecture why this might be the case. Some of it is that unions sort of provide a platform and a sort of channel for collective voice in workplace decision making. So it allows risk and hazards to come to light. They provide, of course, stronger protections for workplace safety, so things like personal protective equipment. There's also, of course, the benefit side of the equation, which I think is really interesting, that with paid sick leave and higher wages, you generally get lower staff turnover. And one of the things that the authors explicitly calls out is that with the higher wages, workers were less likely to either live in risky areas where maybe people weren't being as cautious due to COVID, or they were living in housing that was safer. And then because of higher wages, they weren't leaving and constantly seeking new jobs because of low wages. And so all of those things together, you could kind of see how they all contribute to better healthcare outcomes because of the presence of unions. And one of the things that they call out is that they modeled that if the entire industry of all nursing homes were all unionized, there would have been about 8,000 fewer resident deaths by having workplace protections and having unions. And so I think it's an interesting signal of hope, just to show that like the future of work isn't just about what is happening to the worker and maybe what is the nature of work, but really it has a lot bigger impacts in a lot of different ways with anyone who's coming in contact with that worker and with that workplace. And so, yes, thank you, Lynn, for adding that. That also was true for the case as well. So this is one of these, like, this is a win-win. This is a very hopeful signal that says, you know, by protecting our workers, we're basically protecting ourselves, we're protecting our loved ones. Like, I know if I had a loved one who was in those nursing homes, I certainly would want them to make sure that they were inside of a unionized nursing home versus not, just knowing this. And so you can see how this might point to things being different. So let's go to the next slide. So I really want to hear from you about your interpretation. So if you click there 3 more times, Carter, the rest of the questions will come up. Yeah, 1 more. Thank you. So what are we moving from and what are we moving toward when we think about this signal? If this signal became the norm in the future, what would the world be like? What would the implications of those changes be? And how might we prepare for and or either enable or accelerate those changes today? So we'll take a couple of minutes to do that. Actually, more than a couple of minutes.
Yeah, so if we're imagining a signal where this is the norm, where a future where this is the norm, how would things be different, possibly?
Yeah, so one thing I think about is that, even if you would take these unions outside of a healthcare context, imagine if things like taxi drivers were unionized. Would they possibly drive safer because they know that they didn't have to sort of rush to squeeze in as many rides as possible in order to maximize their wages? You certainly could see other safety implications in other industries as things were showing up.
Yeah, and so these questions are basically every time you notice something surprising that's happening in the present, a signal of change, you can just sort of start practicing asking these questions. What are we moving from? What are we moving toward? If this was the norm in the future, what would the world be like? What would be some of the maybe 2nd and 3rd order implications of those changes? I mean, Vanessa, when you think about a world where we have permanent staff in the care economy rather than, and we have, more secure jobs in the care economy, how is that? What are some of the other implications of that kind of a world?
There's a number of different implications of that kind of world. You think about, caregiving right now is it's a quote unquote multi-billion-dollar industry, but most of it is unpaid caregiving. And so allowing families to free themselves to live their lives more fully because we had a functioning care economy would be a pretty important impact on their workplaces. So for family who are doing sort of free caregiving now to both have to be able to be more productive at work because they knew that their loved ones' health needs were being taken care of. They would certainly experience a lot less of a mental health burden. Like caregiver burden is something that is another source of growing mental health disorders. They could be more available parents to their own children or other folks who they have responsibilities for. They could be more active in their communities. And so maybe there's more civic engagement. There's just more sort of civic life and community life happening. That sort of freeing up of time. And I forget who in the chat mentioned looking at free time. The notion of being able to free people's time is really unlocking a lot of potential.
I think Samara wanted to say something.
Samara, you're muted, so we can't hear you.
Now we all have to get used to.
Yeah, unfortunately, Hopin doesn't work very well with mobile devices, particularly phones. It's hard to get the audio unmuted.
Oh no! Sorry.
Yeah.
More workers if senior care was better. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think another thing I didn't emphasize too is that a lot of our care workers are women of color who are predominantly underpaid, who are mistreated a great deal at work. And so the racial wealth equity gap would be far smaller with a more unionized workforce there as well. Yes, Renisha, that unfortunately is a really common story. People either retiring early or otherwise dropping out of the workforce because of caregiving responsibilities. My mother actually retired early also to help with my grandmother.
Great. Great. So then the final question would be to kind of complete the foresight cycle. You would be thinking, how would I either prepare for or help accelerate these kinds of changes today? And perhaps you're an organization that is trying to develop a policy position, or you're supporting worker activism in some way, or educating people about work in the care economy. There are so many different approaches, but that's kind of the cycle, the foresight cycle that we're talking about. More predictable careers for caregivers. That would be a game changer right there.
I also think that the mobility impact too, a lot of with higher wages, you don't have to work multiple jobs. Like a lot of these folks who have low wages work multiple jobs. So that's more traffic, that's more transit, that's more demands on emissions for moving all around. And so again, another.
Great. So let's go to our last key term. If you can go to our final slides. Yes. Let's talk about what we mean by a forecast. If you could hop over to the next slide, please. The way we define a forecast is a story about the future that is designed to provoke insight in the present. So it's not just any story about an interesting future. It's a story that's designed to help you ask different kinds of questions in the present, to think things that you haven't thought, to perhaps imagine things that you haven't yet imagined. So forecasts need to be plausible, informed by data from today, our drivers, our signals of change, our voices from that wide range of experts. They need to be provocative. And we can create forecasts really about any kind of a concept. It could be the future of the care economy, or it could be the future of nursing homes, or it could be the future of unions in nursing homes. You can take this to a very wide scale or a very narrow scale. And we use forecasts to help us figure out what might be new risks in this world, maybe what might be some new needs that we should be preparing for, opportunities, and all of those should help us think about perhaps new actions that we can take in the present. And if you were to go to Palo Alto and see one of the front windows of the Institute for the Future, you would see this quote painted on it. Any useful statement about the future should at first seem ridiculous. And this is a quote by Professor Jim Dater from the University of Hawaii. And it's just meant to provoke us to remember that the point of doing this work is not to tell the story of a future that everyone already expects is going to happen. It's to tell the story about an unexpected future, perhaps even a ridiculous future to some people. And let's go to the next slide, please. I have an example here of a forecast from the climate space when we try to think forward, looking at signals like the one that Vanessa shared about climate anxiety, looking at thinking about kind of the future of resilience in the workplace. And our story here is in 2032, the personal climate resilience of employees will be a commonly held strategic imperative for responsible and ethical employers. So we might in 2032 not just be looking at a 4-day work week or maybe a 3-day work week, but also what does climate resilience look like in the workplace, and how are organizations providing tools, setting norms, teaching skills that help their employees have healthy responses to eco-despair, which is probably going to be worse in 2032 than it is now, to things like temperature inequity, where we already know that certain parts of the country and certain historically excluded or institutionalized groups, people in schools, people in prisons, people in hospitals, nursing homes, are likely to be most vulnerable and experiencing a kind of a lack of air conditioning, and also maybe organizations will also be trying to help their employees with climate positive practices. Let's go to the next, one more click. And if this were the future, let me just pause to ask you this. If it's the future and in 2032, ethical employers, responsible ethical employers have to be thinking about the climate, personal climate resilience of their employees. What would that mean for you? What would it mean for your organization if you are in an organization or leading an organization? Just curious if anyone has any thoughts here. I mean, for the Institute for the Future, it would mean that we would need to not only be thinking about things like carbon offsets and new ways of thinking about remote work, but that we would actually be having to actively engage our staff in thinking about, more their mental health in regards to the future. There might be more opportunities for action that would be related to the climate. Perhaps we would be looking at the home workspace, not only in terms of what technologies people have, but also, are they warm enough? Are they cool enough? There's a whole bunch of things I can imagine that we would do. Yes, so I think if we go to the last slide, yes, let's walk through some of the takeaways. Daycare on site would help parents manage stress over kids and community pressure. It's great. Oops, sorry. Yep, this slide is great. So just kind of key messages that we wanted to leave you with. Foresight is a cycle. Prepare, foresight, insight, and action. Yes, thank you for that. Tools and space to engage and work with moments of depression and despair as a growth opportunity. That's really, really insightful. Signals should be really surprising. You have found a good signal when you yourself are surprised, when your eyes are opened in a new way, when you have a specific example of how the world is changing. And it's important to look not just for signals that make you feel worried about the future, but also for signals that make you feel hopeful. And you can use signals and drivers to start to develop forecasts about the long-term future, not predictions, but stories that are designed to help you provoke insight in the present. And you personally can develop these foresight habits just by getting more intentional about tracking drivers, about noticing signals of change, about asking those interpretive questions, and combining them into your own creative forecasts. And let me go to Maris's question. Why employers' role in this example to provide? I'm not quite sure. I'm understanding that. Vanessa, do you?
Yeah, I think she's asking why would it be the employer's responsibility to care for personal climate resilience? So there's a couple of things that I can say for this. One is that generally, both when we present forecasts and generally when we tell people that are looking at forecasts is to spend less time kind of arguing with whether or not it is true or it's going to happen, but really to think about what your response might be and what an action might be. So in that case, if you don't think it's the employer's role, maybe your response to that forecast or thinking about implications is, well, how can sort of civil society address this? If this is something, climate resilience is a public problem and therefore a public challenge, a public entity should deal with it. That's a way to kind of engage with the forecast on its terms. The other piece of it is to and I think my brain just went empty. But regarding that, so that's a way of thinking about forecasts and scenarios and how they can be useful, because you could certainly construct a forecast and saying that it's maybe not employers that are doing it, maybe someone else, or maybe there's another construct of understanding climate resilience, but that's why we're gathering a lot of different kinds of evidence to be able to craft that statement.
Yes, and when we are talking about forecasts around in a particular space, so if we were thinking about the future of climate resilience, we would want to develop multiple forecasts. So we're not saying, it's not a prediction, Marites. It's not a prediction that in 2032, employers, ethical, responsible employers will be doing this. it's a provocation. And maybe we would want to ask, well, what would educators be doing? You know, what would be our forecast around legislation? What would be our forecast around activism? So we might want to do multiple forecasts there.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point in chat. Like the emphasis in the climate space has been on avoidance of problems and consequences and not preparing for them. And if you adopt that paradigm, this is just part of risk management that any organization is doing for a number of different reasons, whether it's for market competitiveness or just, you know, the actual facility itself and what risks they might face or other liabilities that they need to prepare for. And so there's certainly, that's also something that we do a lot when talking about forecasts and scenarios, or sort of what other metaphors or what other frameworks might be applicable here that, if, you know, if put in a different situation, either makes sense or sort of give sort of an explanation, like as to why this forecast might exist.
So let's go to the last slide now. And if you're interested in learning more about, you can go through, click through all of these. Thanks, Carter. If you're interested in learning more about foresight, we have all kinds of trainings that we do at the Institute. There is an Institute for the Future, Futures Thinking specialization on Coursera, which is accessible, self-paced, and self-guided. You can join our new Urgent Optimists online community, which is $10 a month or $99 a year. We've got all kinds of people, almost 1,000 people there now, who are thinking about different kinds of futures, sharing signals, helping each other get better at this. And you can subscribe to our monthly Foresight Essentials newsletter if you want to, for tips and tricks and all kinds of new information about how to do this foresight thing in whatever context you are in. So I think that is it for this session. Thank you so much for joining us. Vanessa, I'll let you have the last word.
Yes, thank you for joining us. I hope that this was useful, and I encourage all of you to start adopting signal scanning, start looking for those signs of the future today. You can do that yourself, or you can do it with other folks. It's a really great way to start building this muscle of futures thinking.